Thanks very much, Rish, and I appreciate the opportunity to join this meeting. Let me get to the point where I can see my screen and I can start talking. So I'm going to be talking about what I've learned so far and what we've in our groups have learned so far about setting up communities and some things that may be helpful to you in setting up your communities. So I'll be talking about why communities are important, the strongly felt idea, ways to look at community, what we did specifically in New York and Ithaca, and some of our rough patches. And then we'll be on to question time. So why are communities important? Well, of course, we know that communities build and operate the network. But you know, there are a lot of other reasons they're important. They're a key value for attracting users to the network. The community with the Things Network is something that's really unique. If you try to do wireless IoT using cellular, you're on your own. I mean, you can talk to the phone company about getting a license, but after that, you're really pretty much, you don't have a big group of people to fall back on. Similarly, when using Wi-Fi, you know, wireless is difficult, and there aren't a lot of people who are in a organized community to tell you, help you figure out what to do. Communities also help us, the organizers of TTN, to keep in touch with real needs because we get feedback from people in the group. Communities, and this is very important also, communities reassure us that there really is value to what we're doing. Not only do we get negative feedback, but we get positive feedback. And it helps us learn how to improve what we're doing organizationally. You know, I think that the biggest thing you need when you're starting a community is a strongly felt idea. Now, this is plain English for, you know, the mission statement or the, you know, business school speak. I want to try to use words that are not corporate about this, but it's really important to have a good question about why, or a good answer to the question, why am I doing this? I have my answer. I'll offer my answer now. I've been in the business for many, many years, and I've become disenchanted with the top-down approach to wireless IoT that's driven by large organizations, whether the large organizations be the 3GPPs and the very large phone companies, or whether they be large semiconductor companies. Because there's a mismatch between what those companies need and what the individuals who are doing IoT projects need. There's just many, many mismatches. I can also see the great strength of the Things Network and LoRaWAN technology for the individual practitioners. And then I also feel very, very strongly that there's a huge value to local control and local ownership of our local data, rather than relying on the large organizations who require large economic incentives and therefore require some kind of ownership of something. I wanted to, you know, I was very attracted to the idea of the grassroots organization. And finally, I personally really want to enable wireless IoT to help students learn about embedded systems, to have an inexpensive system that schools can use to help students get their feeling for what this is. Now, I want to say that it's great that your strongly felt idea be clear to others. You will, as you keep getting asked, why are you doing this, you'll get better at presenting it. But it's critical that the strongly felt idea be clear and compelling to you, because ultimately the strongly felt idea is what's going to keep you going through the rough patches. And there will be a lot of rough patches in any organizational development, but particularly with wireless. It's not always easy. And the other thing about that strongly felt idea, practically speaking, your mission should be some form of service to the community, whether it's for profit or not. It needs to be not just about you. And if your strongly felt idea really ends up being about you, then that means that maybe that means that what you're doing, there's a mismatch between what you're doing in the community, and you need to look at that and see how you can align those two better. But certainly, I mean, this is a community effort, and so your efforts have to be part of that community. There are lots of different ways to look at community. You can tell that I have a degree in philosophy. I end up always doing these kinds of breakdowns. First of all, there's the local community. That's what we're trying to start, the local Things Network community. But there are a lot of other local aspects. There's the global community that, the Things Network global organization that is, doing the development of the key backhaul technology. They're doing the promotion. They're helping us as we're starting our communities. They're providing a global forum for interaction. But there are other communities. There's your personal community. Coming into into all of this, there's the personal connections that you have, the other organizations you belong to, and so forth. And there's the regional community. And the regional community is something that sort of is in between the local and the global scale. But that's also very important, I think. If you look at the communities that I'm organizing, I'm initiating two communities, one in New York City and one in Ithaca. And so to give you an idea of my perspective of how I'm looking at this, it's good to compare them. New York City is huge. I say 10 million people. I think it's actually more than that, but this is orders of magnitude. Ithaca is tiny, 100K. New York City is dense. Ithaca is the population is spread out. New York City has a strong meetup.com ecosystem. Ithaca, not so much. New York City has a very diverse economy. Ithaca, college town. It's really oriented around Cornell and Ithaca College. They're the biggest employers are educational. New York City is a hard network environment, difficult, particularly Manhattan, but much of New York City is just difficult. Ithaca, on the other hand, is pretty easy. The local area is basically flat, what's called a penny plain with a bunch of gouges that the glaciers dug when they came through a few 10,000, 20,000 years ago. So you can cover it with a more agricultural, the rural figures of thumb that you see in the data sheets. Culturally, New York City is much more of a Slack and Twitter kind of place. Ithaca is more Facebook and email. So you see people in New York City are using the Google Docs and Google Tools a lot. Ithaca, not so much. It's more, Windows and Word and the sort of traditional stuff. So with that in mind, let's talk about what we did in New York, first of all. Historically, I started first in New York. I saw Venki's presentation in February of this year. I immediately went out and bought a gateway and set it up. And registered the gateway, and to my astonishment, ended up as the initiator of New York City. Shortly after that, I was invited by the Netherlands consulate to exhibit at New York Tech Day. Now, one of the things I'm showing here in this chart is I'm sort of showing, based on, remember my slide of various communities, I'm sort of categorizing which networks, which communities are feeding into each of these actions that have led us to where we are today. So the first step was personal. I did something. The next step was global. The Things Network set me up as initiator, and the Netherlands consulate got us the booth at New York Tech Day. Then I spent some more effort to be able to give the demo. Johan spent a bunch of time on me the night before helping me to get this set up, and so did Multitech. So there was a global community input. There was a personal community input. One of the reasons that Multitech spent a bunch of time with me is that I actually independently knew multi-tech before I started all of this. So all community effort there. From that, I had invitations to speak. And from that, I started developing the strongly felt idea about why the Things Network is important to the local community, to New York City. We had our organizing meeting, and suddenly we had a core group. You know, it was a very rapid transition. Part of that is because New York City has a very large population, so I was able to draw on a large population of technically skilled people, and at that point, I made the transition from being a doer to sort of being the organizer. Ithaca was different. It's a much smaller community, and maybe there aren't that many New Yorks around. There are a lot more communities that are the size of Ithaca or larger. I think there's like 250 cities like this in the United States. I started with the knowledge base from having done it in New York. My next step was to talk to my friends in Ithaca about what's going on. So I used my local knowledge and my personal network. I set up a meetup group. Even though meetups aren't really very active here, it was something that I did anyway because it gave me an easy way of doing things the same way, basically, save my energy. And because I had co-opted a couple of people to help me, they were also able then to use their personal contacts to go find people. So we had a preliminary meeting after which we decided on a name, set up infrastructure, GitHub, the website, this kind of stuff. And then a very key thing for Ithaca was that one of our members wrote and distributed a press release. And of course, as initiator, you have to be involved with that. You have to write your quote, typically. I asked Vinky if he'd be willing to contribute a quote, and he said, sure, what would you like me to say? So I wrote his quote, and he said, sure. Okay, and that's how it works with press releases, actually, normally. You sort of, if you're the energy behind a press release, you do all the work, and you if you can get someone to give you a quote, great, but if you can't, you write their quote, and they say, yeah, I like it. Off of that, then John Bozak, who's one of our members, had contacts with the local media. I got several requests for interview. We got several articles in the local press and local online press. And as a result, our first big meeting, we had close to 30 people in the room. During that meeting, I brought in an outside speaker, again using some more of a regional connection, because this was using the Montevideo group, which I found through the global stuff, or he found us through the global stuff, but they're using 915, and so I thought that was really very relevant to explain to us what it was going to be like. And also, Montevideo is a lot more like Ithaca than New York City is like Ithaca. It's a medium-sized city with the local economy outside the city is strongly agriculture-based, which matches upstate New York. So I have some slides about sort of talking about the personal network. This is an attempt. This is a hope. I hope to give people who are struggling with how do I get beyond the desire to start a community to how do I actually do it. So I'm giving you some ideas here of the kinds of community you already have, even if the Things Network in your area is just nascent. You still have lots of other communities that you can work with. There's your personal community. There's the people you know. There's the people that they know. They're the companies that you know and who know you. There are the organizations you belong to. And if your strongly felt idea extends beyond tech, as mine did, mine really extends to education and local economic development. It's natural to think about your personal, local, social, religious, non-government organization and governmental connections, and then you mine your LinkedIn. If you've got a LinkedIn account where you've got connections, if you're like me, you don't you don't always make those connections unless you go, use the tool and sort of see, who do I know that's interested in this stuff? And that can be very helpful in sort of organizing your approach. The local communities. Okay, well now that one we know about. There's your
Harry, can you share your slides?
Sorry, are my slides not visible?
Right.
I seem to have dropped off then. When did they drop off?
Oh, they never showed up, I think. That's why I found one comment on the events page mentioning about these slides.
I'll share again. Looks like it did drop off.
Ah, there we go.
So sorry. Thank you for interrupting. And my apologies. The slide deck will be posted, so you can catch up on the stuff that you didn't see. The local communities are things like, of course, there's your Things Network local group, and it's critical to have at least one or two other people involved as early as possible. There are affinity groups, and some I've listed here some of the affinity groups that I find helpful in terms of spreading the word. Every community has an amateur radio group, and they're naturals for this technology and for this mission. There are IoT meetups. Because of the bubble in IoT, there are typically, almost everywhere you go, there are people who have heard about IoT and who are interested. In larger cities, you'll have embedded systems related meetups. You'll have student groups. At the local universities, at the local high schools, you'll have robotics groups. At the high schools often, even also at the universities, you'll have perhaps embedded systems. You'll have engineering groups if you've got an engineering school and so forth. Maker spaces, incubators. There may be also, think about industry-specific meetups where you know that industry ought to have interest. Agriculture is a big one. As people keep saying at the meetings I go to this week, farmers are natural tinkerers. They're often early adopters of technology, and LoRaWAN is really, really very good for farmers. Even if you're doing urban agriculture, there's just lots of things you can do, and you'll get lots of people interested, and you'll get some energy. There are some applications in medical. We're seeing that in New York City, where some large organizations are looking at the Things Network for not healthcare, but infrastructure management in medical. Because if you're running a large hospital, the infrastructure is pretty substantial. A lot of environmental uses, environmental monitoring uses of the Things Network. You might want to look at some of the what you might call advocacy groups. Things like groups that are encoding minorities, encouraging minorities to write code, groups that are advocating community development, community economic development, relocalization communities, these kinds of things. Local businesses are part of your community. Some of them will be interested in this. Local education. We've gotten a huge amount of help just with them without them spending much money from the City University of New York. They've contributed an intern who's been instrumental in doing some of the work that we've been doing in developing the New York City community. Local government. In a smaller community, it's pretty easy to reach the people in your local government and get them interested. In a city like New York City, you sort of have to get your act together first, and so that's you have to judge in all of these things. What's your best approach? There's also local regional offices of global businesses. This can be very fruitful. If I'm thinking of things like IBM Zurich, who've been key in development of the technology, and I don't think it's an accident that Zurich is a big area for the Things Network. KPMG has been very important in supporting the development of the network. They're in Amsterdam. They're in New York City, and there are other places, and so they might be someone to approach. Global communities. Well, of course, there's the TTN group, and you should take advantage of that. You can work with Rishi and his colleagues, and and they will give you lots of ideas and help and support. There are the forums. In addition to the global stuff, though, there's some other stuff you should think about. You should be working with the Twitter community, because the Twitter group, the Twitter world right now, the IoT hashtag is extremely fruitful for finding out what's going on in the Internet of Things, and extremely useful for getting the word out about what you're doing. So I have been, actually fairly surprised by how well Twitter has been working for our groups on this. I've made a number of connections that way. Global businesses, that this is, you try to hook up with people like Semtech. If what you're doing is interesting, you try to hook up with people like Multitech if you're using their stuff, Microchip. Global media, global media, it's hard as a local group to really do. This is an area where you want to be thinking about it, and if you have an opportunity, of course, do it. But really, the global media, this is something that TTN Global is doing, and they have a better position for doing it because they're talking about it from the global perspective. The global communities, but you should follow what's going on in the global media. This is an important input for you from community. Global trade associations, again, this is an important input for you, following what IETF, following LoRaWAN Alliance, getting involved with LoRaWAN Alliance to the degree that your budget allows. But there are a lot of resources there. But finally, there's the regional communities. This is important, and it's an area where you as an initiator need to go find the other initiators in your region and work with them to help develop this, because this is an area of where there's a real positive benefit if you can play this correctly, and it's also an area where there's not yet sort of a regional organization. So there's by regions I mean the United States, I mean the Western Hemisphere. So your local political unit that's bigger than where you're trying to set up the network and so forth. Media is an important area. This is where, if you're in the United States, a lot of the United States media is not global in nature, and so that's an area where you as a regional initiator or working with other local initiators can do some work to get attention. And finally, there are trade events. So let's talk about the rough patches so I can finish up and then we can get to the questions. So this slide is the good news, the rough patches that we solved. I had terrible trouble getting good coverage from the gateway in my New York City office, and this affected my confidence in the technology. And this was resolved by the local community doing tests, which convinced me that this was my problem, not the technology's problem. And this was confirmed when we installed a second gateway in better location. So another rough patch, we had trouble getting endpoints working on US 915 with over-the-air authentication. And this affected my confidence in being able to give the technology to the community adopters. It's one thing to give this to engineers. Since my strongly felt idea is that I want to give this to the community beyond the engineering community, it was really important to me that I feel positive that we could deploy the technology and that people could get on to solving their problem without dealing with the details. And OTAA is a very important part of that. And when it wasn't working, I was extremely discouraged. But this got solved because we worked on it. And MCCI and CUNY, did my company's MCCI, and CUNY did some work on this and got it to the point where we felt good about that. Third thing was that other people didn't share my strongly felt idea. And that was, I'd tell people it's what I want to do, and they'd say, oh yeah, that's interesting. And that was solved by inviting others to come speak, especially here in Ithaca, getting HereLab to come speak, Patrick Phillips, come speak, electronically to a meeting of the group. He came in and he articulated not just an idea, but he's actually acted on an idea similar to mine and gotten it to fruition with the LoRaWAN technology. And so that suddenly means that it's not just me. You've got backup from other people. You've got people who are ahead of you who say, oh yeah, this is doable. This isn't just soap that some crazy guy's selling. So rough patches too. So these are the things we haven't solved yet, and this is an example of the kind of things that you'll constantly have to work with as you go through your community development. We don't have a good answer when people ask, is there a literature package? We can point people at web links, but there's nothing coherent that I feel that I can give people who are not technically deeply educated. People who are deeply educated but not technical are actually my target, and I don't have anything for them. We're working on that. The second rough patch is that not enough gateways are deployed yet. You can't really do an interesting application in either of my communities because there just isn't enough coverage. Some of that has been held up because we needed better installation instructions for my audience. So, this was to build my confidence in asking people to go do this. We needed a success kit so that the smart non-technical people, when they got their gateway and set it up, they could immediately do something with it and see that it's working. We've now got a prototype that I've developed with my company. We need exciting evidence that this works to motivate others, and that's happening with the site scans that we've been doing both in Ithaca, in New York, and in Ithaca, and also with talking to people like Patrick Phillips and Peer Lab. And the last thing, of course, is that not solved yet is being patient. In the technology world, you tend to want you want to see it now, you want to see something happening, and you get frustrated when stuff just takes a while. You just still need to just keep transmitting the strongly felt idea to others and help convert that to action. There are a bunch of resources on this slide which you can use if you want to build on the work that we've done. One of the things that the New York and Ithaca groups have really felt strongly about is we want to make this possible to take what we learn and make it possible for other people to build on it. And so we're very eager to get questions from people and to try to help the next stage of communities and to sort of build a kit to help people do this. We've got some of this ready. Some of it we may have forgotten to write stuff down, or it's in personal notes and we have to get it on the GitHub. When people ask is typically when it happens. One thing I want to tell you out of personal experience, you want to be very careful when you're choosing images to put up on a website, because it can be an expensive mistake if you get an image that you can't back up your claim that you've got the rights to put it on your website. People like Getty are always looking they're using automated tools, they're scanning websites, they're looking for misappropriated images. And if you have an image that you don't have a valid license to use, it can get really expensive if it's one of Getty's images. So a second thing on branding, if you haven't done this before, follow the standard guidebooks on sizing and formatting your images for each one of the places where you're putting your images. It's interesting. I look around, and it's a common thing that people who are setting this stuff up and doing lots of different things, they don't think about, well, I got to resize this and make it exactly right to make it look good on the screen. That's it. So I want to say thank you very much for your attention and for listening, and thanks to the Things Network for setting this up.
Awesome, Terry. Thanks a lot. I'm sure there was some hidden insight about what not to do and what things to do to manage a community, and more on that. I think there's one question which I have for you, and that is that how do you see the importance of a use case while building a community? I mean, you've been an initiator of 2 communities now, and I've seen things around. So how do you see the value of a use case?
Well, that's a really good question. It depends to a large degree on your audience. What I have found is that some audiences really obsess on the use case, and some don't. I definitely believe in what at the last webinar, the TTN webinar, the presentation slide said, nobody ever, it's like, come up with a use case and I'll build a network. That's not how it works. Or come up with a hypothetical network and I'll build a use case. Typically, the way things really work in engineering is that you have to get people something they can work with before the use cases will start to happen. But you still have to solve the problem of helping people imagine what this might be. So you have to have some reason for people to get excited about this. And non-technical people may not have the faith that technical people that the use cases will just come automatically out of this. Or they may get crazy ideas about what the use cases might be if you don't come up with grounded, well-grounded use cases. There's a fine line to walk between giving people some detail and getting lost in the details. It's very important to sort of say, well, look, there are use cases. Here are some use cases from various other sites. The main thing to bear in mind is that the use cases may not be very compelling to your local community. One example of a use case that is great in some communities and not great in other communities is the Amsterdam lead use case of monitoring water in boats. That, I think, is a great use case. And in Ithaca, people think that's a great use case because Ithaca's got a big lake and there are people who've got boats, and so it's and it's a sort of democratic activity. In New York City, boating is not really a democratic activity, and so talking about that use case doesn't fit with my strongly felt idea that this is a profoundly democratic technology, and that the reason I want to do it is for reasons of equity. If I were to, in New York, if you start talking about something that makes life good for boaters, you get pigeonholed, and you don't want to get pigeonholed. So you need to choose your use case there. And in New York, we tend to talk about trash cans. When the trash can gets full, that you have to go empty it instead of sending somebody around on a schedule to empty all the trash cans, whether they need to be emptied or not. So every city is different, and the use case for every city has to be somewhat different. That's why you want to have, as soon as you can, a core group of 2 or 3 people that you can bounce ideas off of and come up with some straw man use cases. Those might not be what you pilot, but they will be enough to start getting the next round of people that come into your group thinking along the same lines as how you're thinking.
Awesome. Chris, I have one more question for you, and I think being the community manager, I've faced this question too many times. And the question is that a lot of people are looking to initiate a community at this side, but they're not really well versed with the technical side of things. And so what's your advice for them to get started and kind of get some education on that part?
Great question, Rish. Well, at the risk of being a bit of an evangelist, I recommend that people look into amateur radio. Now, this is if you're interested in radio beyond just the Things Network. If you're just looking to work on the Things Network and you have a very specific use case, it would be quite a distraction. But if you want to learn more about about RF, how to design antennas, and get a really a gut feeling for how the technology works, amateur radio is an amazing resource. So at least here in the States, you can get a license for $15 for 10 years, and you have to take a simple knowledge test, but then you're allowed to operate on many different frequency bands with up to 1,500 watts of power. And there's a whole community of people, largely from a previous generation, who experiment with this all the time. And it was actually the amateur radio community that discovered a lot of the propagation characteristics and developed many of the modes that we use today for communication. So that is a great resource there, both the documentation that's been written for amateur radio, but really speaks to radio in general, and just that community, as Terry mentioned, tapping into those people and connecting them with IoT has been really valuable for me. Personally, I knew very little about RF. I was scared of it prior to getting into amateur radio, and now I feel very confident about it and have this gut feeling. So that's a first place that I'd look if people are interested in radio more broadly.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris, for the answer. Terry, I have one more question from Muhammad here on the Google Events page. And he says, have you guys ever faced any trouble from the government or any law enforcement in terms of creating a network for public use, wherein people are not paying any fees and they cannot control or monitor it?
Well, that's a good question. We worry about that. We worry about that in the form of in the United States. We worry about that in the form of the question, what do we do when the bad guys figure out how to use this network to do something bad? So that was like that question was asked, I think, at our first group meetup. The thing is that in the United States, the political situation is still such that we're pretty free to go do this kind of experimentation, and it's sort of you don't have to prove in advance that you're going to do no harm. In other countries, that's a bigger consideration, and you have to look at your local situation. I've heard from people in many different countries who are doing this. Some of them are fairly are much more strictly regulated than the United States, and it's not. It's not such a. They don't seem to feel the concern. There's the Things Network is deployed in is it Weinan, right? In China, and it's deployed in a number of South American countries with different levels of legal system and so forth. I think that the real thing to say is, what can you do with LoRaWAN that you couldn't do with Wi-Fi? And the answer is not really much. I mean, if you're a bad guy, Wi-Fi is much easier to work with, and there's lots more ways that you can use it. And cellular is even more broad spread. And there's lots of ways that you can use it and misuse it. LoRa doesn't really. LoRa is much more economical, but those economies really only apply if you're doing thousands upon thousands of things. And a bad guy is not going to be able to deploy thousands upon thousands of nodes without getting noticed. That's just not really sort of it's not a likely attack scheme. What's more likely is that they'll be, doing, a small group doing something small but major, and so from a reasonableness point of view, I think that it's reasonable to say that LoRa is not really making things any worse. From a regulatory point of view, of course, this is something that somebody decides, and it's not necessarily based on logic and evidence. It's based on emotions and feelings, and you have to work with that. One good thing to tell people is like the data is doubly encrypted, which means that there's less opportunity for somebody to put in a bad gateway and do something bad, because they can't really easily prevent other gateways from being able to forward the data, even if they don't forward the data. And because of the encryption, it's hard for them to inject traffic. At this point, you're on to second order kinds of things that every network has to worry about. I don't know if I've answered the question. I hope you're posting follow-up questions if I'm like off in the weeds about what you're worried about.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Terry, for answering the question. So I think this is now almost time that we come to the end of the session. It was, I think, great meeting Terry and Chris. Chris was regarding the technical side of things, and I'm sure a lot of people would have understood things which they probably wouldn't know about. And Terry, thanks a lot again for sharing your experience and sharing the things that people should do or shouldn't do. So it was great catching up with both of you as well. For everyone else, you can still post your questions on the Google Events page. Terry, myself, and Chris will keep an eye out and we'll answer them on the page itself. And for everyone else, we'll be continuing the series every couple of weeks. So watch out on social media and the newsletter. We'll post a date and session for the next webcast soon. I hope you all enjoyed the session and enjoy the weekend, everyone. I will see you later. Bye-bye.